Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Kyle Medden. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum, and I'm so excited to have all of you here to see just these awesome panelists who are going to speak today. It's such an important issue, but I'm going to let Michelle talk more about the issue in a minute. Some housekeeping before we start. If anyone needs to use the bathroom during the presentations, there's a bathroom straight out that back door and to your left across from the front desk. So feel free to use it at any point. A little overview of how the day is going to go. We're starting right now at 9 a.m. for the welcome, which is going to run right into the first panel. We're going to have a 15-minute break at 10:30 until 10:45. The second panel is going to begin at 10:45. That's going to run until lunch at 12:15, which is going to last an hour until 1:15. Panel 3 is going to start at 1:15 and run until the end of the day at 2:45, when I'll give some brief closing remarks, and then we'll let you guys get out of here. And at every session, we're going to have a Q&A session towards the end of the panel, and we really encourage all of y'all to ask some questions and really engage with the speakers, because we're hoping for this to be a discussion, not just us talking to you. So without further ado, let me introduce Michelle. Michelle Nolan joined the Duke faculty in 2008 as a supervising attorney for the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. She's done a lot of great work with them. And she's currently our faculty advisor on the journal. She serves as the chair of the board of advisors for the Duke Campus Farm, as a faculty advisor for us, and as a member of the community advisory board for the Superfund Research Center. And she's done just a lot of incredible work in this topic, and I'm really interested in hearing what she has to say. So please join me in welcoming Michelle Nolan.
Thanks, everybody, and I'll echo Kyle's welcome to Duke Law School. And I also want to give a real thanks of appreciation to the students who are with the Environmental Law and Policy Forum, our environmental law journal here at Duke. It's an interdisciplinary journal. It brings in students from the Nicholas School of the Environment as well as the law school, and I think it's one of the best publications in the environmental law field. They've organized an incredible talk today with diversity of perspectives from academia, from lawmakers, from policymakers, from agencies, and community members. So really, really nice job, and I'm very excited to hear how the day unfolds. This is really an important issue because for far too long, people have thought about environmentalism as preserving wild places, and particularly wild places that are special to a particular segment of our population without regard to the needs of other populations and other communities within our country. This is all really coming back to environmental health and the ecosystems where people live. Just right next door, there's a conference today, unfortunately overlapping, on environmental health, bringing together scholars from across the university and outside the university, looking at community-based and community-directed scientific research about how those ecosystems and how the health of the environment affects our human health. So this is a very strong intersection, a very important topic for today, and something that we're going to have to contend with increasingly as our society continues to grow, as our urban centers continue to grow. When I was first starting practicing law here in North Carolina, one of the environmental justice activists I used to work with would always admonish me and tell me that I needed to hug people, not trees. And I'd like to amend that statement today and say hug people and trees, because that's really what the environmental movement ought to be about. I've been fortunate to live here in Durham since 1989, when I first moved up here from Florida to attend school here. And over that time, as many of you know, Durham has changed radically. For many of you students, you're coming here at a very specific point in time. There's lots that Duke and Durham have to offer. But you don't have necessarily a sense of how far the community has come, how much it's changed, and what that means to the long-term residents here. We have a phrase in Durham, kind of a catchphrase that somebody coined, keep it dirty, Durham. And I think that serves as an important reminder of our industrial roots and also some of the gentrification that is happening around us, where we're losing some of that quirky and dirty edge. Part of that is very beneficial in terms of improving the environment of our urban center here, but part of that also has an aspect of displacement that we need to be concerned about and more attentive to. So I'm very happy to see that Senator McKissick is here. He's my senator here in Durham and has been a longtime advocate for many of these issues. So hopefully he can continue to bring that strong voice to our legislature. And Senator Mike Woodard, also from Durham, will be here later on today. So some of the issues that the panels will talk about today are gentrification and some of maybe the beneficial aspects of an improving landscape. More trees, more open spaces, cleaning up some of the dirtiness that had kept Durham down and its people down for a very long time. We'll be talking about transportation, how people move around that landscape, and how we can perhaps make not only a more convenient and enjoyable urban environment, but also one that's better for the planet by reducing greenhouse gases. Mass transit is something that's very topical right now in the Research Triangle with a proposed light rail that will connect different cities. Duke University is a critical part of that conversation and is poised to make or break that proposal from the donation of a little bit of land. That's something that the administration is trying to make decisions about right now, and each of you in this room has a voice in that decision and can help influence Duke University to make the right decisions about supporting mass transit in this area. Just at the end of last week, Governor Cooper announced a very ambitious plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the state of North Carolina in keeping with the Paris Climate Accord. And a lot of that will depend upon electrification of our vehicle and mass transit systems. So the governor has pledged that over the next several years, they will phase out fossil fuel base for fueling the state's vehicle fleet and move to electric vehicles. There are lots of details to be worked out in that plan, but I think you start to see the influence and the confluence of these issues around transportation that this panel will address today. And the last panel is going to talk about ecosystem health and the importance of the environment, the ecosystem of our urban places. I've been doing a lot of work in some of the urban centers in North Carolina around lead contamination of housing, potential lead contamination of drinking water, and there's a group over at the Nicholas School that is starting to look at lead contamination of soils, including in our urban environment. That's very important as we talk about playgrounds where children are going to be, whether it's in a daycare facility, in their own backyard, or in some of the community spaces that we're trying more aggressively to create here. Those are all types of things that affect the prosperity of a region and the health and opportunities that individuals within our community will face moving forward. But of course, it's more than about just lead contamination and potential toxics. It's also about the infrastructure that we have, the quality of the air we breathe, the trees that we have in our landscape. And so I'm really excited to hear about some of those landscape features and also more information about the health of that overall ecosystem. So in other words, I guess to sum it all off, kudos to DELPF for creating such a wonderful conference and set of panelists for today. And I join you, I'm sure, in looking forward to everything that is to come later on. So thank you.
So we're going to go ahead and get started with our first panel. If our speakers can come down and take a seat. Good morning, everyone. I am Jennifer Thalusma. I'm one of the symposium editors on the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum, and I'll be moderating our first panel. Today we have with us Dr. Danielle Spurlock, who's currently a member of the Department of City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel Hill. We also have Professor Timothy Johnson, who instructs Energy, Environmental Policy, and Sustainability at the Nicholas School of the Environment. We have with us Senator Floyd McKissick, who represents District 29 in the North Carolina State Senate, and this includes parts of Durham. And we also have Professor Kofi Boone, who instructs landscape architecture at North Carolina State University. To start, we'll give each of them about 5 to 10 minutes to tell us a little bit about their work, and then we will begin our general discussion. So if we could start with you, Professor Johnson, or I'm sorry, Professor Spurlock.
Hello, I'm Danielle Spurlock. As my introduction states, I am an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel Hill. I will tell you a little bit about myself because I think it's important to know that as we talk today and what is central to my research and why I think it's key for an interdisciplinary group of folks to come together with community members to really shape policy. I came to planning through public health. When I first graduated college, I just knew, well, I had already made the shift towards public health, but I just knew that I wanted to be with a place or with an organization that would do the crosswalk between community work and technical information. I worked at the Alameda County Department of Public Health, which was one of the first public health departments to really provide health data to neighborhoods. So breaking down county level data to neighborhood data and seeing the process where that really, in many cases, empowered community members with their own information to make policy change. I came to UNC many years ago. I thought I was going to be in and out. I was going to come and then I was going to go to a larger city. And of course, I've fallen in love with the area because that was back in the early 2000s. There, it became clear, and why I did public health and planning is living in San Francisco, being very clear that I had a bundle of privilege that, one, I was a one-person household, I was employed, that navigating the food system there, navigating the transportation system, navigating the housing system was a complexity that for even someone who had those kinds of resources, what would it be if I were trying to shop for a family of 4, knowing that the bus that served the grocery stores would sometimes turn off their real time because we don't want that accountability to say that the bus is actually going to show up on time. Seeing the differential pricing between what the same bundle of groceries would cost if I was at the Safeway that was in the historically Black neighborhood versus the Safeway that was in the historically white neighborhood. So I came to UNC Chapel Hill, and I count among my influences many scholars of the environmental justice community here in North Carolina who pushed me to think, how do we think about the environment, sustainability, given that we come from a system that has built itself, has reaped immense rewards from being inequitable. That means there's going to be a lot of pushback as we shift to redistribute resources to make sure that those harms are remediated, but also paying it forward. So let's not shift that harm, a landfill or toxic land use, to another community that looks like theirs, meaning usually communities of color or low-income communities. So my research really looks at how do we unite technical information, because there's always going to be a role for technical information. Everyone doesn't need to learn hydrology if we're going to have a conversation about flooding. But we also need to give a place of privilege and to local knowledge. All of you live someplace, and you know that neighborhood better than I do. And we need to find a way to unite those two so one is not marginalized. And yet it constantly is. So much of the research I've done in public health, in planning, with other members of this panel have been, how do we have that conversation about uniting technical information and local knowledge? The project that is central to, there's other projects that talk about stormwater and private property, and if you want to know more about that, I will talk about it till your ears bleed. I'm very excited about all of my projects. But the one that I think first and foremost people will be interested in is a community-based participatory research project we've been doing with a community in Durham around this question of gentrification, displacement, and neighborhood change, using a number of engagement strategies so that we can unite what folks know about how the neighborhood is changing and the issues they're seeing with the technical information, because the technical information can lead us to blind spots. For example, we have a number of community members through a number of different engagement tools that have identified flooding as being a major issue. If you look at the floodplain maps and the locations that people say flooding is occurring, they don't match up. And so it's very clear, and it's understandable why, if you're looking at the floodplain maps, you're not going to say, we really need to do some outreach in this community. And yet it comes up over and over again. The issue is, in many cases, it's stormwater, but it's also street cleaning. It's having a conversation that the technical information isn't always going to actually capture the issue identification. And more to that point, even if we have a particular issue identified, we're going to have to talk to community members and work with community members as we create our policies to address it. And I will leave it there as we go to the next person.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for inviting me to the panel. I'm Tim Johnson. I'm Nicholas School faculty. I direct the Nicholas School's professional graduate energy environment program. I've been at Duke in one form or another for, 2018, about 13 years. If I can maybe make a connection, I have an academic background in both engineering and public policy. And so if you had to summarize everything I do in a few sentences, I'd like to work on technical problems that have significant social dimensions, social and policy dimensions to them. Problems where you need to understand the science, the engineering, but you can't ignore, again, the political, the economic, the historical, that larger social context. For the last 20 years or more, I've been working on problems at the intersection of energy and the environment. So again, as I mentioned, I have background in engineering. I like the analytical problem solving, the pragmatic problem solving. I didn't want to balance assembly lines or design widgets for a career. In fact, I wanted to be in a more mission-focused organization of some sort. I didn't quite know what that would be, 30 years ago. But found my way to Carnegie Mellon. They have a rather unique engineering and public policy program where they take people who have a technical background and basically give them, the training in policy, economics, and related fields. So after I finished my work there, I came down here to RTP to work for the EPA. The EPA has two large research labs and several smaller labs around the country. The two big labs, one in Cincinnati, the other one down here. EPA's presence down here, both in a regulatory context as well as research, the research side of it, predates the EPA. Thank you, Terry Sanford. But I worked at the EPA for about a decade for what you could probably describe as an internal think tank. We were focused on energy, the environment, and climate. And our role, there was about a dozen of us, our role in the agency was to help the EPA understand how changes in the ways in which we supply and use energy would affect its regulatory decision-making going ahead, the next 5 years, 10 years. I have very strong interests in the intersection between energy system planning and the built environment. So here at Duke, I teach classes on transportation. I'm doing that this fall. I'll teach a course on buildings, the built environment in the spring. Again, with energy as a central theme. If you look at, say, energy use or emissions, kind of at the end-use side of the energy system, buildings are responsible for about 40% of our energy use, transportation for about 30%. In fact, if you look at greenhouse gas emissions now, we emit more from tailpipes of vehicles than we do from power plant flue gas stacks. So you add those two areas together and you're talking about, not quite 3/4 of our end-use energy and a lot of our emissions. So I've I guess, established a niche here at Duke focusing on those areas. At Duke here, we don't have a planning department or a design school. Certainly have an engineering school, but we don't have an architecture department or, again, a planning school. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the type of work I do here. When back in 2005, when the energy program started at NIC, I wanted to get back in the classroom. I'd been out for a few years. Started teaching as an adjunct and was recruited to join the faculty here and take over the energy program at NIC. So again, very broad interests in the areas I mentioned. Again, thinking about the built environment from the infrastructure, from buildings to energy infrastructure across that space, particularly in urban areas, to the systems that operate across it, like transportation. Projects in all those areas. A lot of work recently with electric vehicles and air emissions, collaborating with the Nicholas Institute here at Duke, as well as the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. This is the buildings panel, so I should probably address some of that. Again, a lot of interest in particularly how you take an existing built environment, and say retrofit that to be more energy efficient. How, very interested in issues of densification, not just, if you think about, energy in the built environment, and here I'm going to have to span transportation and buildings. If you wanted to reduce, overall energy use, at the kind of personal level, that's, energy use and emissions tied to how we move around the landscape, and then also, to our buildings themselves. But they're related. And so again, a lot of my work and research interests, kind of sit at that intersection. To what extent, would, densification, for instance, moving to a more compact environment, reduce transportation energy use? How do you do that in an existing urban area? And then on the building side, what does that mean for energy use as well there? So again, through teaching, advising, research, that's kind of where I am.
Well, I'm State Senator Floyd McKissick, represent Senate District 20, which includes Durham County as well as Granville County. Of course, when I first got there, it was only in Durham. Then it got redrawn to Durham and Granville. Granville's very rural, Durham immensely urban, and now it's redrawn again, so in January it'll be back to Durham alone. In terms of academics, my background has been multidisciplinary. I got a master's degree in city and regional planning over at Carolina and specialized in land use planning and financial management, worked in that field for a number of years. I did a lot of work when it came to large-scale mixed-use developments and new communities, and even lectured on that at a number of universities, including School of Architecture at the University of Virginia up at Charlottesville and many other places. Having worked in that field, I went up to Harvard and got my master's in public administration and worked in that field for about a year before I got my law degree here at Duke about 34 years ago. Now, in terms of kind of public service focus, I did serve on the Planning Commission here in Durham during a time we were undergoing a lot of growth, change, and development, and served in that capacity for about 5 years, as well as our Board of Adjustment. So it gave me a pretty interesting insight in terms of, from one angle, knowing what developers are looking for, the other side, knowing what public bodies are looking for, and working very closely to rewrite our development regulations here in Durham. And then served on city council here in Durham for about 8 years, and oversaw the part of the council at that point in time called the Public Works Committee that dealt with all issues in land use and planning and transportation in those particular departments. I've been in the state Senate now for about 11 years, and having that background that I've always had, one of the things which I initiated going back to around 2009 was a legislative study commission on urban growth and infrastructure to see what we could do in terms of state policy to help address issues even here in North Carolina, not just in Durham, but across the entire state, because we are increasingly urbanizing as a state, and what we do in terms of land use practices and things to encourage sustainability made a whole lot of difference. One of the things that came forth from that study commission, I chaired that in the Senate. Representative Jennifer Weiss chaired it in the House, and we met for about a year or so, was the idea of coming up with a Sustainable Communities Task Force, which I was able to get a budget. We had legislation that was first drawn up, and then I chaired the part of the budget that oversaw things dealing with the environment. So I make sure that we got that written into our budget bill back in 2010. That task force was in fact established, and kind of giving you some idea of the kind of things that it did. It It was kind of an interagency collaboration between our departments of administration, dealing with all the office space requirements and things of that nature here in state government, our commerce department. And at that point, we had a combined department in environment of natural resources, transportation, health and human services, the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency that deals with kind of initiatives and programs for housing across our state. And it focuses upon creating sustainable, healthy, safe, walkable communities and increasing accessibility. Among the things we're looking at were increasing better transportation options for safe, reliable, economical transportation, motorized, non-motorized, to help get vehicles off the highways, improving our air quality, reducing greenhouse emission standards, promoting public health, looking at equitable housing options to increase those as well, but also looking at better utilizing our existing infrastructure in terms of water and sewer in inner city areas, and looking how we could decrease transportation and housing costs and expenses for people, and improving North Carolina's economic competitiveness. I hadn't looked at this stuff until last night because we had worked on it about 10 years ago. And it moved forward very well. We got together regional partnerships, the COGS, the Council of Governments, to work on these initiatives. I was able to get about $500,000 in funding that we put toward this whole effort and initiative. And it really did a lot of work. We looked at practices that could be established by local governments to look at sustainable development practices and some type of scoring system that could be used for evaluating plans as they came along, and kind of modeled after some things they were doing up in Massachusetts. To give you some idea of the kind of people that were serving on that commission, we had people such as the planning director from down in the Winston-Salem area, Paul Norby, the planning director from down in Charlotte, planning director from over in Greensboro, agency heads from all of those various departments that I've previously identified, such as environment and transportation alike, people from the nonprofit sector as well, and people from self-help, the credit union, to look at some of the things they were doing. And we actually were very successful in getting about $3.2 million here in North Carolina to help with sustainable development initiatives that we're undertaking as a result of federal funding that was available back in that time frame. One of those grants, I think it was about $1.6 million, went to the COG up in the Asheville area. Another $1.6 million or so went to the COG dealing with the Winston-Salem area, and as well as making local grants that were available. And the local grants went to communities across our state, and a lot of times it was matching funds. They had to put a certain amount toward it to look at sustainable development practices that would be and policies that would be used and built upon. We got off to a great start. Everything moved very well. And then what you saw happen was that there was a change in leadership at the North Carolina General Assembly. No longer were Democrats in charge. Republicans came along, and one of the first things on their hit list was going in and repealing the legislation that created this particular task force. So the task force existed for about a 2-year period. They had long and extensive reports that were compiled. I got 2 of them here from back in that time frame, which I could get into more specificity and detail in terms of some of the things that came from it in terms of recommendation. Of course, if you look at some of the things that were fueling this back in that time frame, between 1990 and 2000, North Carolina had seen a 21.4% increase in population growth. And then between 2000 and 2010, it was like another 18.5%. We've moved now to being the 9th most populous state in all of the country. So you needed to think about these things in a comprehensive, global way that we could do from a state level and to tear down the silos in state government so these agencies started talking and we could support expenditure programs, initiatives that created safer, more walkable, more livable communities, and also looking at the aging of our population and what that meant in terms of transitioning from where they might be today in single-family homes more into mixed-use developments and higher density developments in years to come, and knowing that we wanted to incentivize development that made the best use of infrastructure, incentivize development that was looking at transit-orientated development that capitalized off of potential mass transit that would be built in the Charlotte area and being thank God we're getting a little closer to getting it built here in the Triangle, but that's been a tremendous challenge and a tremendous problem for a variety of reasons that I could get into later. But that kind of gives you an idea of the background I have, what my goals have been, and some of the initiatives that we've taken from a state perspective, and some of the things we'd love to see us get back on track.
My name is Kofi Boone. I teach landscape architecture at the College of Design at NC State University. I'm a Detroit native, and I went to Michigan, and I was in Ann Arbor during the Fab Five era, so I got mixed feelings about being at Duke right now. But glad to be here. Landscape architecture, a lot of people don't know what that field is. It's the design and planning of the built environment, everything but the buildings. So the campus you're sitting on right now, for example, is the work of landscape architects, as well as major infrastructure projects that affect all people. I went to the University of Michigan, and while I was there, a lot of people have heard the name Robert Bullard associated with environmental justice. He calls himself the father of the academic movement of environmental justice, but it was actually a very broad coalition of people. And one of my professors there was a guy named Bunyan Bryant. He was traveling all the time to Warren County, North Carolina, when I was an undergrad. And I didn't know anything about North Carolina. I knew Michael Jordan, that was it. That's all I knew about North Carolina as a Michigan resident. But what I didn't know that was happening was a group of people who for the first time were using what we would call civil rights movement tactics to fight the location of a PCB landfill about an hour away from here. They failed in that fight. They were able to build that, but it built this broad-based approach, and that's really the birth of the mainstream environmental justice movement. It's actually in our state in 1982, and that became the contents of Race and Toxic Waste, the report from the United Church of Christ, which was led by Ben Chavis at that time. Ben Chavis, a descendant of John Chavis, who was a Raleigh native. John Chavis Memorial Park is in Raleigh, in the South Park East Raleigh neighborhood. And that report, which talked about the correlation between race and proximity to toxic waste, independent of income, independent of class, independent of a lot of these other factors, was really the beginning of at least the academic movement in environmental justice. And I'm bringing it up for two reasons. One is with regards to landscape architecture. The first reason is that it talks about why North Carolina as a state is important to the broader story of environmental justice. But it also brings up the persistent and intractable issues with race in the United States. Because these people chose this action because they were excluded and marginalized in the mainstream environmental movement. And I have a Bachelor's of Science in Natural Resources, so I'm a certified tree hugger. But in landscape architecture, environmental problems are people problems. There is enough land for everybody. There's enough clean water. There's enough food. There's actually enough energy. But we've constructed our ways of living in ways that push against that opportunity. And it was really the scholars in the scholars in environmental justice that predicted the kinds of things that are being talked about now in terms of the conflict between people and the land and those impacts that will not just be local and specific, but global. They were talking about global climate change 30 years ago, Black and brown people. One of my good friends, Mike Dorsey, went to the People of Color Summit that was in Rio de Janeiro in 1991 that produced the 42 principles of environmental justice. And the very first one was we speak for ourselves, which is to say that in all processes we find ways to position the most vulnerable Black and brown people to be the voices and the measure of the impacts. And as an educator, it's hard because when I look in my classroom, it looks like your classroom. And I'm always struggling with why we don't have more people from these vulnerable communities and vulnerable populations in the places to learn the technical know-how to go and address these sort of challenges. And it came up recently, my one and only time going to the White House was a forum that was convened by Mustafa Ali before he stepped down from the Environmental Justice Network at EPA. It was a White House roundtable about vulnerable communities. And what was really interesting was that in their minds, all these people from all these grassroots groups were really thinking that the pathway to innovation and protecting communities was innovation and energy. I've spent the last couple years of my life dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew. We established a partnership with 6 communities. I've been working for 2 years. The main one that's probably most salient here is Princeville, North Carolina, which is the oldest African-American town in the United States, which again is only about an hour and a half away from here. But there are these patterns that recur that are in the landscape, and the disconnect between policy and law and the tools and practices that we use in architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, engineering, the invisibility, the lack of making those real issues visible and also have power to affect change has been cast right in my face. So in the rural areas, if you go to places, there's a phenomenon that's specific to the South called racialized topography. It was coded and termed by a couple of political geographers in 2006, but it says that you can, in 120 southeastern cities, other than on the coast itself, you can correlate altitude and race, which is to say that the higher elevations invariably, those old anecdotes about being on the other side of the tracks and all this other stuff, and it ends up being real in southeastern cities. And vulnerable populations, Black and brown people, find themselves in low-lying areas in many of these cities, the areas that are most susceptible and vulnerable to the consequences of climate change, primarily flooding. It's almost like an algorithm. What I was shocked about was the Triangle Journal of Council of Governments, the Council of Governments, their publication. They did analysis, and they said even in the Triangle, 15,000 more people live in floodplains in the Triangle alone since 2000. And if there's one thing that, regarding climate change, that is something we have to talk about, is why people are living in areas where we know with certainty that every time that there's going to be an event, they're going to be the first affected. And in many cases, it accrues. So there's a whole language of environmental justice, locally unwanted land uses, LULUs. There's a whole number of things that kind of find their way in the least desirable land. So toxic waste, prisons, hog lagoons, take your pick. You can almost predict based on just the way that the land is situated where those things will go and what they mean. So I've spent a lot of my professional and academic career. I worked for 10 years, a big corporate firm, practicing more mainstream landscape architecture, particularly at home in Detroit. We were the ones that did Tricentennial Park and Governor Milliken Park and the Detroit Riverwalk. That's us. So if you ever go to Detroit and you go on the Detroit Riverfront and you walk, right now you can walk 4 miles from bridge to bridge on the Detroit River. All of that was junkyards, cement silos, toxic waste dumps, everything manageable that's there. And there was that transformation seen as universal good, which is like flips to open space. I have 2 young kids that grew up here. Whenever they go home to see their grandma in Detroit, that's the first place they want to go. It encourages people to get outside, lead healthier lifestyle. You see people have a total transformation in terms of their self-perception and their sense of worth and their belonging to the city, just because we've created these civic spaces and these forums where you can be a citizen, you can enjoy yourself. But here, by contrast, also working on the Durham Beltline, which is not far from here as well. And this growing correlation between making these big public investments in infrastructure, the things we universally thought were good, parks, playgrounds, improved streets, more shade, but not being mindful of the private economic impacts that ignites, what's known as the Highline effect, if you're familiar with New York City, where they tracked the development of an elevated park in the southern end of Manhattan to explosive private market responses, to the point where the island of Manhattan, other than the Bronx, no one in this room has enough income to have a middle-class lifestyle there. So this correlation between public investment and displacement is a current environmental justice issue that we're currently attempting to deal with now. And we know that there are strategies for doing it, right? So one that we watch a lot is 11th Street Bridge Park, bridge in Anacostia and the federal area of Washington, D.C., a decommissioned bridge that's turning into an elevated park. But the development of an equitable development plan in advance of the construction of the park, which is to say, the park design was done by two international leaders in design, OMA out of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and Olin out of Philadelphia, two premier firms. But 10 years before they build this thing, they're investing in moving people from rental to homeownership. They're creating community land trusts. They're dealing with small business development and economic development opportunities tied to the park. How can it participate in the economic lives of people? And it doesn't guarantee that people won't be displaced, but it's the new trend, it's the new pattern, which is we can't just say, hey, isn't this park great? And then, oops, you know, nobody who lived there, who demanded that thing, is able to even enjoy it because they can't afford to live there anymore. We have enough evidence that that's the problem, and we're excited about being able to try that out in our own hometown. So those are some broad strokes just to get started.
I guess to start off, I am interested in asking you guys, because each of you kind of touched a little bit on this in your opening remarks, in what ways can people who are actively thinking about building more sustainable environments further engage community members in order to ensure that their voice is included and that marginalization is being addressed? I guess Professor Spurlock would like to start.
Usually it needs to be an expansion of how we engage people. Right now, in a lot of our policy making, we might have a public meeting. It's often legally required to have a public meeting, and then maybe we'll have a public hearing. Public hearings are important parts of the larger policy structure, but they can't be the only way we engage people. The format alone leads to you've given someone maybe 3 minutes to talk about something that's going to, in many cases, could change their lives, and it pushes people to the extreme. So it pushes people to say the most explosive thing possible. If you build this high-density development, my children will no longer be able to grow up and live here. We push people to say very extreme things that forecloses our ability to actually find a win-win situation. If we actually, because one of the courses I teach and work in is development dispute resolution. So how do we create engagement processes that don't lead people to, one, really voice their positions. Positions are very difficult to change versus the underlying issues, and pushing them to the extreme to make themselves heard. Because they won't feel heard. They only have 3 minutes. Of course, I'm going to say what is really going to stick in your mind in my 3 minutes, if that's all that I'm given. So we need to think about how do we expand our processes so that folks, on one hand, can express themselves and not necessarily in a very adversarial situation, because in many cases, again, public hearings mean that I sit up here and then someone comes and they have their 3 minutes to speak directly to me, but also the room. So even the physical setup of the room can really elevate the anxiety. So we need to expand how we engage on any types of conversations, but particularly on conversations where we want to put equity at the center. We want to put sustainability at the center. We need to think about other methods to bring people along. So it's not you must stand up and convey your interests. Everyone doesn't know it. You don't walk around knowing what your interests are in every situation. We often know what our positions are, but we're going to have conversation. So how do we create engagement processes that allow people to have conversations in many different formats? Again, so it's not always I must be an eloquent verbal communicator for my positions or my interests to be heard. I think, and I'm pretty sure Kofi will talk about this as well, how do we make sure that once people come to the table that they're prepared to have that conversation? Previous to coming back to get my PhD, I worked on a project that looked at hurricane preparedness. This is in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and it was looking at 6 states and the District of Columbia that had been hit by Hurricane Isabel. Our method was to actually bring people along. So we often ran parallel processes between service providers, agencies, people who had a lot of technical knowledge, and then community members. We ran them parallel so that both groups are being engaged. It's not we're going to engage one group and then engage this other group, because that can lead to issues of power dynamics and inclusion. But understanding that everyone isn't prepared to talk on particular topics once they're introduced. So this parallel process allowed people to talk without service providers, without agency heads, in a way where they can learn about the issue, they can map out their own interests, and then those two groups can come back together and actually start talking about solutions versus saying, come to a room, talk about solutions now, but I can often use my power as a technical expert to shape that conversation and marginalize voices.
Yeah, just building on that a little bit, the planning community has used alternate formats to engage the public. Design charrettes, for instance, where you'll set several hours in an afternoon or evening aside. People work in small groups, sometimes on paper, sometimes using computer planning tools, to work through the issues and the trade-offs, the complexities that surround whatever development or proposed development options are on the table. And that sort of thing where you're bringing people together, they're working together, so they have to collaborate. That gets away from that kind of top-down, being spoken to model. The issue there is, and as with regular hearings too, is that people have the time, and a lot of people don't, or the people who do are, not necessarily the people who are going to be affected most by, development. And then you're starting to see experimentation with alternate, formats. I'm from Minneapolis. Minneapolis is right now is in the middle of a pretty significant debate around its revisions to its 2040 comprehensive plan. Minneapolis is growing very quickly. It bottomed out at about 365,000 people about 20 years ago, after being over 500,000 people. Now it's heading back up to that level as a lot of people move back to the city. So we have a big housing crisis, really, affordable housing, both rental housing and just regular owned housing. And so moving towards a denser environment, is in a less auto-dependent environment is important. The city leadership's taking climate as well as issues of equity very seriously. One of the proposals under the initial version of the 2040 comp plan was changing the zoning code to allow fourplexes throughout the city. Fourplexes aren't a high rise, but that alone was extremely controversial and has led to a lot of debate within the city. And now the revision to the still a proposed plan has backed off on that a little bit. But in rolling that plan out, rather than the sort of top down, we're going to present the plan and it'll eventually be voted on by city council. From it, the planning department there used and engaged a number of people to present this in alternate formats. So meeting at a brew pub and go through the plan. The plan has not been printed on paper; it's strictly online, and so you can engage with it in a different way. So I think you're starting to see this, an effort to move to alternate formats that are less top-down, less hierarchical, that are more inclusive, and that reach people in environments that don't look like traditional, governmental or planning, forums.
And when I think about what can be done structurally to really encourage and guarantee greater participation from, I guess, those that reside in local communities, as well as those who are active, engaged in these issues, I think back to one of the ideas that we were kicking around with the Sustainable Communities Task Force. And that was coming up with like a local government scoring system that you would use for evaluating proposals as they came along. I know as a member of city council or as a planning commission, you're always looking at things on a per project basis, which is fine, but there's no uniform set of criteria that you can use to evaluate things. It tends to be upon who are the loudest voices in the room at that time, or who are the members of that body at that time, and how sincerely they feel about proposals. I mean, you know, if I'm sitting there, I know I'm going to be looking at pedestrian linkages. I know I'm going to be looking at bikeway access. I know I'm going to be looking at whether it's coordinated in a way where people who are using mass transit, be it bus stops, are able to do so, and whether those bus stops have shelters. I'm going to be looking at the connectedness with other pedestrian access point in the area, or what's being done for recreation within that community if it's a residential type community. But, you know, that's based upon who the member is. You got to get beyond who the member is so that whoever that membership is based of, they're looking at potentially the same type of things. And the thing that we had wanted to encourage through that Sustainable Communities Task Force was getting the local councils of governments in areas and then having them work with local governments to establish committees that would be standing committees within cities or towns or counties, as the case may be, that would be composed of people that would be stakeholders and would be able to look at these proposals as they came through, but would be active, involved in knowing the issues locally so that these scoring system, it might be a typical template that be used across the state, but it could be customized for those particular communities. And I think you almost have to institutionalize it to get some type of standing committee involved that's soliciting public participation and input. I always love the charrette process that's so typically used, but you can't always know. The charrette process tends to work really well for big things. It's not used typically for smaller type of programs, but you really need to have people ongoingly on a regular routine basis using some type of criteria for whatever projects come along, and also trying to guide things in a way that makes sure that when they're updating the plans, the comprehensive plans for area, that a lot of these principles are incorporated and are thought about in a long-term way strategically.
Can I make one quick comment? I will say, and this is my larger arc of trying to kill this in planning, the use of the word charrette. It means something to us, but it doesn't mean necessarily anything to community members. I know this because when I came to public health, and everyone in my planning courses was saying charrette, charrette, charrette. I'm like, what does that mean?
Right.
I mean, the context suggests that it's a design workshop, but I don't know why they're not saying that. So it must be something different. I don't know how it's spelled. I can't sound it out. I can't look it up. So it's one of those things that we easily fall back into, but we have to be very careful of, because if I see a notice that says, oh, let's go to a design charrette or a charrette, I'm like, I'm not going there on my Saturday afternoon. So it's even shifting how we say the language, even when we use more inclusive methods, that it's clear what that more inclusive method is.
A fair one. I know what charrette means.
Yes, of course, you do.
I'll explain it, and then I'll offer a piece. Charrette is literally a term meaning on the cart.
Mm-hmm.
And on the cart comes from the L'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And actually, the model of the L'École des Beaux-Arts for teaching design is still the dominant way that we teach design. It's where the studio came from. It's where assigning a project and then having students generate designs using drawings. It's where that whole process came from. But speaking of environmental justice, social equity, most students couldn't afford to live on campus. So they lived wherever they lived in Paris. And so when they had to collect an assignment, they would send this horse and cart out to pick up their assignments through the neighborhood. And there were literally students on the cart finishing their projects before it rolled into the school. Yeah. So it's that short, intensive, active kind of burst, but laden with all manner of injustice. So there you go. I think with community stuff, the first and most important thing is establishing trust. And I think that one thing that we have in common, the design professions and the legal professions, is that we're dominated by fee-for-service approaches, which is to say, you got a budget and you got a time frame, and usually those things aren't set by the actual client or community you're serving. They're set by whoever's providing the resources, and we cram our processes within those constraints, and that forces us to skip a lot of steps, primarily trust building. So the Knight Foundation, for example, has emerged as a way of resourcing alternative engagement strategies that allow for slow, incremental relationship building prior to a decision being made. And so we're not a Knight community here in Durham. Charlotte is. And they're doing some really interesting things where people they just got dinners and picnics for like 2 years. Like, they're not talking about planning and design and building yet. They're getting to know each other. They're having sort of the informal social activities. This is hard to manage in a corporate structure, but you will find that the innovators in this regard are outside of that, because in certain cases that trust requires time. Once you've established trust, you can go pretty fast. The last thing I mentioned is to build off of one of Danielle's points about indigenous knowledge, local knowledge and privilege in that. We did something like that in Raleigh using smartphones. And I know there's a lot of articles now about screen time and all this stuff, right? But you know, we did the scan and we were like, well, what is a tool and a device that everybody already has in their hand, right, that allows them to connect? And we did a lot of asset mapping, meaning asking people to document the places that have value to them that, as an outsider, we would never understand. So this situation where we had a lot of senior African-American women self-recording digital videos using smartphone devices that we were able to link to a map. So 54 map points and videos later, they reveal all of this evidence of the value of these places that we would not be able to see, that impacted policy. That was part of the evidentiary base that got John Chavis Memorial Park designated as a National Historic, on the National Historic Register of Places, got a $12.5 million bond issue for restoration based on some of these stories, you know, and became the basis of a heritage walk, which allowed them to provide self-guided tours to tell other people about the value of those stories. So it was decentralized. You could go to the place, you could go anywhere, you could be a journalist and shoot your friend while they're talking, you could talk to yourself. You know, it allowed for a decentralized and aggregate way of building it so you don't have a single story. And I think that that's a real advantage. There's a lot of downsides to this sort of thing, but that's one of the real advantages, is the ability to self-pace, to create that dialogue, and to produce artifacts along the way. One thing that frustrates communities, you ask them to come out to meetings and go to these charrettes for years, and maybe nothing happens, or if something happens, it has nothing to do with what they want to do in the first place, and there's nothing along the way that provides benefit to them other than extracting them of their information and their time. So building into your process the give back at every turn. So in this case, even if we weren't able to get to protecting this park and affecting policy, they now had a document, they now had an archive of the stories that are valuable to them that they could share with whoever they wanted. So building those incremental wins into an engagement process such that you're not waiting until the end in order for the community to get some real benefits is a big, important thing to consider.
In what ways can, like, when we're thinking about building energy infrastructure, can we use our thought processes to ensure sustainability and equity at the same time, like hitting that balance?
You're looking at me. You know, if you think about where to start with that one, you look at energy costs, I guess, you know, as a share of household income. You know, it becomes pretty, I don't want to say insignificant, but it's not that great as you get, you know, middle incomes and above. You know, the transportation costs, you know, even when gasoline prices are high, tend to be less than 20% of household income. So it really, it's, I'm trying to think of how to put that one, but so you definitely see the energy, you know, just the raw price of energy being more significant, you know, for people who are economically challenged. I think one of the big issues, the problems there is with anything you do to save energy, there's a big fixed cost that leads to savings in the future. And that's true if you're, retrofitting a home to make it more energy efficient, or even buying a more efficient car. There's an upfront cost that's often a pretty big hurdle, even though in the long run, you know, the savings in energy costs, make up for that. And I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers, you know, again, especially for people who are economically challenged, you know, the chances are they have infrastructure, their home or whatever dwelling unit they're in. And if it's rental property, they probably have a landlord that, you know, is not that concerned about the energy costs because, you know, they're not paying the utility bills. Or, they're, again, people have older cars which are less efficient. And again, it's how do you get around that? I mean, if you are the owner, where do you get the money, the funding to, pay for whatever you need to do to save money in the long run? Again, if you're renting, how do you convince an owner who's not going to recoup those savings, but who is going to have to pay for the energy efficiency upgrades, to do that? And I think that's probably one of the biggest hurdles. There are programs out there, especially in other places. You're not seeing a lot of it here necessarily. PACE funding, for instance, where you can fund really through your property taxes over time energy efficiency improvements to a home. Again, you'd have to be a homeowner to do this, but the unglamorous things that really do save energy in a building, like adding insulation, sealing up ducts, and crawl spaces and that sort of thing. But that's still very expensive. Again, the upfront cost is difficult, but there are programs, through say the PACE program, where you can basically pay that off in your property taxes over several years. So it's an example of a program that helps get around that fixed cost hurdle, but it's still there.
And I guess I would simply say it's such a generic question when you talk about reducing energy costs. I mean, you could take it to the point where you are looking at decreasing the expenditure of what it takes for that person in a rental home, right, and when they owner occupy to decrease the cost. I know Duke Energy has programs now, and they're going into low wealth areas and specializing in trying to go in and make improvements to the homes of people in low wealth communities that are rental properties that otherwise they could not afford to make sure that their costs are reduced because it's reducing for them how much capacity they need for electric generation in the long run. So, I mean, they're kind of self-motivated to do it in some respects. At the same time, I mean, if I think about things from a policy perspective that you might do at a local government level, you're looking at things that are really perhaps getting people outside of their vehicles more and getting them on public transit. But if you're getting them on public transit, you have to have a good comprehensive transit system that they can depend upon, rely upon, so they're not waiting a half hour for a bus, because not many people are going to take it. If it's coming every 15 minutes and it's going to get you where you want to go and it's economically priced, or perhaps has no true cost at all. I mean, like Chapel Hill, their transit system is free to those who use it. So, I mean, if you move to that type of user-free system, but it's subsidized in some other way, then you're going to increase utilization of transit by establishing a broader, more comprehensive network and reducing barriers to access. And, and increasing the number of stops and frequently in a community. And then just looking at how one might do that more globally in terms of a state and in terms of how you fund transit, so that you're not looking at transit being highways and roads and bridges. You're looking at mass transit being a more viable and significant part of that equation when you're evaluating how you make those public investments. So, I mean, it's a pretty big question. And I think it can be dissected into about 8 different parts, and there are ways that you can attack different subcategories to make it work, and I think that's critical.
Okay, I'm gonna ask just one more question, and then we will open up to the audience for any of their questions. How do you, in building and designing retrofit areas that have already, that are already pretty populous and pretty well established, in order to make current areas more sustainable rather than kind of building from the ground up?
Should I start again? Yeah, that's the challenge. I mean, you need greenfield sites. Although it doesn't necessarily address affordable housing, where you have a lot of dead malls in the country. Malls that have, that were popular when I was young, but have now well outlived their usefulness or attractiveness. And as those close up and are being torn down, you often have land, and this is not in the core city often, but that, land that is now available, open, that can be redeveloped and, it's higher density, mixed use. So that's one. Urban infill, again, I mentioned, the proposed changes to Minneapolis's, comp plan that would allow higher density development, and it's a fourplex, not a, 20-story building, but, even at that, throughout the city, and that's become very controversial. But that's, another example of how, you begin to take some of those steps. But, the reality is when you look at, we're still such an auto-dependent study that you have to have transit and land use and building. You need to be thinking about all those things together, and we have a history of, doing transit planning and land use planning separately. And that has to, come together. You can have, a really green building, but if it's not accessible, you're, right back to riding in a car. So, it's that, there have been studies of, density, to what extent would you reduce vehicle miles traveled if you double density, for instance, and where those studies have been done, empirically, you have to use a natural experiment because you're not going to go out and do a controlled experiment where you're going to build two communities and see what happens. But where those studies have been done, the reduction in vehicle miles traveled as density increases in the existing environment is really not that great, because we're still part of this larger urban area or metropolitan area, and we have certain lifestyle expectations. I expect to be able to go to a large grocery store and get what I want when I want, as opposed to a smaller neighborhood store. So I mean, it's a mix of a lot of things. Again, from the need to integrate different planning domains, land use, transportation, right down to, like I said, just now, expectations for, how we consume and live.
And I would tend to agree that there's been this separation historically. I mean, I think the land use to transportation have to come together. I mean, that's what the goals have been historically with transit-oriented development, to accomplish that, to get the higher densities, to decrease dependence on the automobiles. And of course, when you look at this broader question as well, I mean, you can look at communities here in North Carolina, in fact, right here in Durham, where 20 years ago, there were many parts of our urban core and what was called North Central Durham that were blighted, that had a high concentration of homes that did not meet building codes and requirements. That really were basically rental properties that were in terrible, terrible disrepair. Now, you can have programs that incentivize the owners of those properties to give them low-cost loans or forgivable loans in some instances to reinvest, to make sure those properties are brought up to code and people who occupy them are able to live in good housing. But what you've seen occur, particularly over the last 10 years, is that this gentrification has occurred. And there's been lots of these urban infill lots that have been passed by that are now being built upon because the land values are going up. And I think anybody 20 years ago would say we want to see those urban infill lots utilized because you have existing infrastructure there that's unutilized today. And many would say that, a lot of those houses that were falling into disrepair or were completely dilapidated, that if you can go in and invest in that housing stock and make it livable, usable, and it meets codes today, then that was a good thing. The problem is the displacement of the people that were previously there. Where are they going to go? Where are they living? Are they further away from the urban core? And how do you accommodate their needs for housing? So, I mean, there's some great challenges in this. There are no real easy answers. One thing that has occurred as there's more investment in the inner city, here in Durham and other urban areas, you see greater tax dollars coming in and a greater opportunity to do things in terms of low-income housing, or I should probably put it a better way, housing alternatives that will address low-wealth populations. And I think that's the critical part of the equation, how local governments and state government can do that, perhaps through our State Housing Finance Authority or through local governments and what we do. I know at one point I served as chair of the Durham Affordable Housing Coalition. We got about $40 million of bonds passed that went into helping things locally in Durham. It was all concentrated, I think it was about 95% of it for rental properties and for places where people would live who were low-wealth individuals that were making 60% of the median in the area. So, I mean, can it be done? There are models, and I'm sure there are many things that can move forward other than the models that have been used.
All right, so sustainability is, we need a new word. It's been appropriated and co-opted and all kinds of things. The most innovative work in the world is retrofitting existing infrastructure. If you had a city the size of the same pattern as Barcelona, you could fit the whole global population in the state of Texas. We got enough room. Most built cities in the United States, 60% of them are streets and parking lots. There's plenty of room, but what we're dealing with is mindset and policy. So this might be a common language that we got. What makes the United States unique from other parts of the world is that we went through urban renewal. We decided after World War II that there was a priority on decentralizing our cities because of the Red Scare. They did analysis determining that Russia had bombed 13 American cities. It would wipe out over 50% of our manufacturing and 60% of our workforce. And that there was no way to move military from East to West Coast in less than 2 weeks on existing roads. That's what led to the Federal Highway Act. That's what led to the Federal Housing Act. That's what led to 50 years of incentives to make us basically destroy our cities. And all that overlays an environmental justice standpoint with race, because urban renewal almost exclusively targeted Black and brown communities, low income. In our own backyard, the Hayti community in Durham Freeway is a scar of that era. And it's not specific to Durham, it was an algorithm. There are hundreds of cities where the exact same thing happened. So we were in the business of destroying and decentralizing our cities for protection from nuclear holocaust. And what's happened since that is no longer in the common conversation is a rise in the reinvestment in cities. And so we used policy and mindset to artificially devalue cities and make them unattractive for investment. And there were thousands of people left in the lurch, not able to build wealth and pass it on to next generations, not able to fund public infrastructure adequately, including schools and streets and public spaces, not able to sustain themselves. So now that the engine is on regarding reinvestment in our city centers, all these people are left in the lurch. So with regards to the broader topic of sustainability, one thing that I like, I have a colleague, Dr. Tia Martin, who for many years was the head chief resiliency officer for the city of Boston. And they just approved their resiliency plan dealing with the implications of sea level rise, but it was based on, as Danielle said, disaster risk and threat and preparedness. Is that when she looked at it, you would think it was a lot of technical stuff, like we got to put up seawalls and we got to, deal with all these other things, deal with water. But she was like, no, it's racism. Because of the way that the city of Boston is policy, segregated populations that actually put vulnerable people in the harm's way, they're least prepared to deal with disaster. So they're able to weave that story into the technical know-how of retrofitting streets to turn them into flood barriers when necessary. They're actually retrofitting downtown Miami right now to be able to do that. They're raising all the roads in Miami to actually work as many flood walls to deal with that. Really rethinking industrial landscapes that are no longer in use, that could be storm, surge, and storage. So if you go to Brooklyn Bridge Park in New York, beautiful park, great view of the Brooklyn Bridge. The whole purpose of that park is to accept the storm surge of a Superstorm Sandy. It's the only park that was not destroyed from Superstorm Sandy because it was designed in a way to accept all of that flood and protect the rest of Brooklyn. So the technical know-how of retrofitting these places is right. It's the mindset, and it's the disconnect between the social vulnerability of people who've had to suffer through the disinvestment era that are not prepared to participate in the prosperity now. So that's the game. As a landscape architect, I could redesign Durham to make it sustainable, but the whole demographic would shift unless we are proactive about matching those strategies to the people in need.
And I will echo that we need to put a conversation about race, particularly in the South, but throughout the U.S., at the center, because you can have a number of folks, and it's under the concept of aversive racism, where they will say, and they will have statements that I I am for affordable housing. I am for environmental protection. I'm for sustainability. But when it gets to the nitty-gritty of what they might have to give up, and by give up, I mean accept a denser landscape, they'll fight tooth and nail. We have to have that conversation about why certain groups can have the capacity to move into historically disinvested communities, get a lot of help through maybe the historic tax credit program, and reap huge increases in wealth that were denied to other individuals. That will have huge implications for wealth and wealth building. Wealth building in the US is really tied to home ownership. When we have systematically denied that based on race with redlining and policies that come from the federal level down, we have a lot of ground that needs to be made up that won't be made up with that wealth disparity. We have to have those conversations, and in the words of Mitch Silver, the former planning director of Raleigh, when you say no to something, you're saying yes to something else. If you're saying no to having a denser landscape, you're saying yes to housing inequality. You're saying yes to more energy consumption. How do we have those conversations so people will align their actions, not with just one interest, but the whole interaction of what they say is their value system?
We will now open the audience for questions. Summer will either come around with a mic, or we also have one. Oh, okay, cool. So we'll start with you in the back. Summer will bring you a microphone.
My name is Mark Dreyfors. I run an organization called Goal Site.
Professor Spurlock.
Well, if we're talking, one, about some of the financial tools, we really run into this issue with the discount rate. What do we expect profitability from a system and from some of these innovative tools that is predicated on previous models. Those previous models were profitable because of the inequity. They're profitable because they are systematically draining wealth from, or capital or labor out of a system, because we aren't compensating people for their labor at the appropriate level, or we're exploiting disadvantage. So one is actually having a conversation about the discount rate that is used to show that particular new innovations are profitable, because there are areas that would, when we're thinking about sustainability, there are definitely areas of conversation that discount rate should be closer to zero. We shouldn't be valuing the future dollars so much less, or the future in general so much less than we do the future, the present. And that is one of the financial tools we need to have a conversation about. We also need to think through partnerships. So what you'll hear over and over, particularly in the affordable housing arena, is that the state, because we're not a home rule, we're in this kind of space between Dillon's rule and home rule in North Carolina. The North Carolina does not allow for inclusionary zone. We can't force people to make affordable housing. It's used as the argument to end the argument about affordable housing within the private sector. But there are ways that we can have conversations. We can't require it, but if we are entering into private-public partnerships and we have as a public sector, skin in the game, you can start having that conversation with developers. In particular, I think there's a lot of potential with the development agreement process. This is a process that takes it out of, it's a larger process, it's more types of information can be included in the development review process. We can have a wider range, a wider scope of how we're having that conversation and what the give and take between the developer and the agency there, usually the city or a jurisdiction that they're negotiating with, can have. And that conversation can be about amenities that aren't necessarily regulated. Instead, you're having a conversation in a give and take. We also have to have a conversation about what do we actually mean when we make statements that we need to have mixed income housing, and then making the argument that each development needs to be mixed income. That's actually going to overall give us less affordable housing, and we need to think less about, well, my opinion is that let's think about mixed income areas. So if you have the opportunity to create a number of affordable units, but they're not mixed in with market units, but the census block area has mixed income, that might be what our goal should be versus saying each and every development has to have that profile, because it actually leads us to producing fewer affordable units than we can. So we have to think more creatively about how we can negotiate within the system, because the system is going to take time to change. It is predicated on social stratification and really disadvantaging those who are at those lower strata.
Would anyone like to add?
One thing I might simply add, the only way you're going to change the relationship between state government and the cities is to have a really broad consensus that needs to get redirected in a way that, you know, you're going to take something like the North Carolina municipalities. I think it has now about 540 or 560 communities that are a part of that. They need to be active, engaged, and working with members of the General Assembly. You got 120 members of the House, you got 50 members of the Senate, and you got to have the North Carolina Association of Counties on board too. I mean, you got to have the stakeholders that are interested in changing that historical relationship which has existed in this state. If you don't have that fundamental buy-in, it's never going to happen. And with the leadership in Raleigh today, there's great resistance. I know I've been working on rewriting basically our land use regulations with Senator Lee out of Wilmington that would basically recodify all the laws we have in land use and zoning. And we're making pretty good progress on it. It's not really ready for prime time yet. We've got a lot of pushback with some of the things that we introduced, okay? But it's right now, I mean, I like the development agreement model. I've worked with developers on large projects to really get things done that would never have been part of the development process. You know, you get $14.5 million for transportation-related improvements that otherwise wouldn't be put in, which local government and the state couldn't require, okay? But you can do it through negotiations or you know, the problem is with some of the people that are there today, they'd like to prohibit the ability of local governments to even enter into development agreements, which can be very instrumental in bringing about somebody who's, I'd say, if they're an active, interested player that needs a little bit of persuasion to understand that they can make it a better project and a more inclusive project, a more walkable project, or whatever it may happen to be. You can get developers who want to do that. But unless their arms are twisted sometime, they won't just offer it, okay? So, I mean, you know, but if you have people who don't believe that that's even a good model, that you developers should ever be able to even do that, you got a problem from a public policy perspective.
Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask? We have one question up here in the front.
I actually have one quick comment and then a question. I just want to bring up an initiative that the city of Durham just launched. Some of you may be aware of it. It's the participatory budgeting project that they just launched actually a couple days ago. It's an initiative of the city that basically this community can decide where $2.4 million gets allocated to community-driven projects. If anyone's interested in learning more, I'm happy to talk about it at a break or during lunch and point you in the right direction. So just to kind of tie in to our discussion on community involvement. My other question is, how can we challenge the State Utility Commission's monopoly on energy and allow for renewable energy sales?
Would anyone like to say?
Well, I mean, basically, the State Utilities Commission has the power to reconsider its policies and the way they structure and evaluate things. So, I mean, it really would take the commission itself to sit down and come up with methodologies that they feel or deem are appropriate. Now, obviously, there will be public hearings that would be held, and I'm certain there'll be many stakeholders that would come out and express opinions. But the the members of the Utilities Commission are appointed by the governor. They are confirmed by the Senate, and then they go in and they operate pretty much autonomously. So I mean they're pretty much working on in autonomous ground, but they certainly have the ability to go in there and I think if there was enough enough people from the public coming out and saying this is something we believe in, something needs to be done, they would have their staff go out, do a review, and then come back and probably have public hearings and think about how they can reform and reshape it.
It looks like we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm Landis Maestrom with Bike Durham. I have a question that is not just for Senator McKissick. So I really appreciate a lot of what was said. My question is partially about governance, which is why I want to keep it open to everybody. But obviously, I think you'll have some things to say, Senator. I think it's really valuable to know that the transportation planning in the country was largely motivated by a very scary, real factor like warfare. And I think the fear of that is real. Something that I'm interested in is trying to give courage to elected officials. Courage might be a condescending word. Trying to give that kind of motivating factor to elected officials while another thing that I've been hearing from this panel that's really valuable, while giving power to communities, right? And I think there's a difference between Hayti being demolished for a freeway and Forest Hills reacting against density, right? I think, I don't know, maybe this is a false dichotomy. I want city officials to be able to say, tough luck, right? We need density in order to make this work. How we're going to do this? And yeah, so there may be two questions. Do you think that there's that those two things are against each other? Is giving communities the power to determine progressively, not just defensively, the future of what their neighborhoods will look like, and giving civic leadership the courage to make bold decisions that need to happen?
Professor Boone, would you like to begin?
No, but I will anyway. So regarding density, I think it's a bit of a red herring of an issue. It's been co-opted as a term, I think, as a scare tactic, right? So when you hear density, you hear people who can't afford to own a single-family detached house, who are probably y'all, young, loud, lots of cars, and in my nice little neighborhood, I just don't want that junk. So this whole mythology that's around density. And it's ironic because, allows people when they travel to Europe and other places, it doesn't even come to mind. They enjoy walking the streets and the plazas and taking public transportation. It's like, wow, I've been in Italy for 3 months and I didn't take a car one time. And you kind of just come back and you're like, So it's difficult. I'll give a real world example. We did the comprehensive master plan update for a city called Grand Rapids, Michigan. And that was the number one issue that people said. They were like, look, we like our single family detached houses, we like our big yards, and we like people who can afford to live like we do, and we don't think density is compatible with that. So what we had to do was create a local density guide for Grand Rapids, where we actually went out there and we calculated the density of every existing neighborhood. And there's one of the oldest historic districts in the country is this neighborhood called Heritage Hill in Grand Rapids, and they held it up as sort of the exemplar. This is the example of standard living that we want people to have in the future with the master planning. We're like, you realize that's the densest neighborhood in Grand Rapids too, and they all kind of went, what? You know, and it's because they all had alleys and they all had accessory dwelling units in the back. So density in their mind was 6 to 8 story, big parking deck, small apartments, ugly design, no offense to the city of Durham, but some of the density that's being built is atrocious from a design standpoint. It does not win champions of the idea. It actually perpetuates the myth that it's bad. So proper design matters, but there's all kinds of ways of expressing density, right? And that density has a variety of forms. And when you started to talk about accessory dwelling units as opportunities to generate income from your property, right? So you could give it to, a neighbor, you could give it to a friend, or you could actually use it, to generate revenue to offset rising property costs on your existing property. It's a real debate. So I think that in terms of a design role, the thing I want to talk about is it's not one size fits all. And it's actually getting people to articulate the broader conversation, which is their fear of the type of people that they're being attracted, that will be attracted. And it's a misconception. So breaking that myth. And one of the things that was important for us as a tool that people can use to break that myth was to show people, right, the places that they enjoy. Do you like having access to a grocery store? Do you like having enough tax base to have a great school? Do you like walkability and not feeling like you're going to get run over by cars, right? Well, density is a solution to doing that. More bodies, smaller place is great. But that next step of the experiential knowledge of examining your own backyard and seeing that the places that you actually like and enjoy are the densest was the game changer, right? Forest Hill's doomed. No offense to anybody in Forest Hills. You're not getting no density there. But there are other parts of Durham where you probably can and will, and it'll be great.
Go ahead. No.
I do think it's a larger conversation as we reweight local knowledge and technical knowledge, that we don't weight it such that those who already had power, and even within the local knowledge realm, had power in the old system don't have oversized power in the next system. And I think that's a larger conversation that's happening in Durham as they think about their equitable engagement plan and policies. They don't exactly know how that's going to go because it's a very difficult conversation, because if you're elevating local voice, how do you say, well, you also have to have a power analysis about what you're elevating. If I'm elevating it such that certain communities who already had power to say no can now say no even louder, that's going to be a difficulty because we actually haven't balanced the table then. We've treated everyone equally, and that is still going to end up in an inequitable system.
And the thing that I'll point to with local officials or even officials at state level, they simply need to have political courage, okay? It's really simple. You have to be able to sit there and do some independent analysis. If it's an appropriate place for higher densities, then you should approve them, notwithstanding the backlash that you may get. If it's an appropriate place to put in a certain type of housing that may not be popular because it may bring in a demographic that may not necessarily be welcome to the community, you have to have the courage to do it without regard to who is in the room or what they may say. It's really not that challenging. Now, sometimes a person's courage may depend upon how they were voted upon. Now, in Durham, everybody's voted on at large, even if you run from a district. When you're in communities where you run from a district and the voting on individuals, when they get reelected, is only from people in that district, then they're going to listen more attentively to those people in that district and what they have to say. If you geographically just have to live in that district or voted on at large, then you really need to be listening to the entire community. I can remember dozens of projects that I voted on as either a member of the Planning Commission or as a member of City Council that were not always popular when they came along. And yet those are some projects that probably transformed Durham in certain ways. Things that were in our downtown, things that were on our suburban fringe. And I could talk to you more about them, but, you know, you had to have the courage to say, if these concessions can be made, if we have the appropriate things that are in that development agreement, then maybe it's not a bad thing to do. I think of something, for example, over near our kind of the Southwest Durham area, South Point Mall, where it is today. Are you familiar with that? Extraordinarily controversial project when it came along. But it was fallow land, unused between two interstate interchanges, Federal Road 751. If you were going to have a regional mall on the main street of the Triangle, that was the place to do it. That new interchange that went in on Interstate 40 out there was $3 million. All the other transportation improvements out there cost another $10 million. To put in landscape medians, put in underground utilities, to go in there and say you must have a new independent design that doesn't look like a cookie-cutter mall all over the country. So you have a part outside that's pedestrian, a more interior mall that's different. And also guarantee that you're going to offer options in terms of people coming in for shopping amenities that are not offered in the marketplace today. Now, at the time, people would have preferred to see that site used for a Home Depot, our Costco, our Sam's Club, just one single user on that big site. Maybe two. It would have been a completely waste for that particular site. So do you sit back and listen to those who say, hey, we just want one box, big box here, another big box, or a Circuit City here, and we have two big boxes? Or do you come up with something that actually can work in a way that makes sense, that generates sales tax dollars, that lets you do an awful lot that you otherwise couldn't afford to do as a community? I can tell you right now, there were 700 people who would have preferred to see the Circuit City, the Sam's Club, the Best Buy alone, no more than two on that site. And I can also tell you that I've probably seen thousands of people say it was the right thing to build once it got there. But the same is true for affordable housing. The same is true for a multitude of things that you look at. You got to have the courage to analyze it, think about it, make trade-offs along the way. When I say trade-offs that make sense in terms of the community benefit, and then have the courage to vote on it.
Professor Johnson, do you have anything to add before we? Okay, it looks like we are out of time. Please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause.